Okay, so let me get this straight. We're finally not talking about the British. I can't keep talking about these people, their accents. They drive me nuts. I mean, can you imagine? Oh, are we recording?
No, keep going. Keep going. It's fine. I
Um,
want to hear you talk about the British more.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Matt, and this is the Poor Proles Almanac talking about plants, collapse, and not empire.
No, we don't do those anymore. We actually only talk about history.
Fuck.
All
Really?
history all the time. You know when you
Jeez.
hit like 35, most people care, or men care about, is World War II.
Yeah, it's early onset Republican.
Yeah, we did that. We had that phase like a couple months ago, and now we're into like the hippies. Like I guess World War II for our generation isn't the same as previous generations. So like the boomers had World War II. We have the hippie movement, right?
True.
So that's what we're talking
As
about.
terrifying as Omaha Beach.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
that's fair. So we're going to talk about history. Sometimes we're going to, in this case, we might talk a little bit about plant history.
What
Sometimes we might talk about collapse history, just for you, Matt.
what niche is
We
this?
talk about the collapse of plants in history,
Oh,
the most niche.
beautiful.
Yeah, in the words of our beloved David Cross, there are dozens of us. Dozens! So for the three people that get that, thank you.
I feel like we have some Arrested Development fans.
Yeah, maybe. We are going to talk about other stuff at some point. My hyperfixation on this agricultural history that we've been diving into has been mostly appeased at this point. So we're going to be done with this series in a few episodes. Then we're getting back to our summer interviews, and then we're getting back on that plant content. So I'm excited. I already got some interesting ideas for next season.
All right, let's get through this season first. We still got some trudging to do.
Oh my God, Matt. Come on. All right, so what are we talking about? The back to the land movement. So at this point, we've talked about Scott Nearing, the overlaps of organics and biodynamics, the rise of counterculturalism, and how religion kind of weaved its way through this like new naturalism that seemed to underscore all of this activity. Now, while we didn't cover it in depth, it should be unsurprising that there was a large homesteading movement during the New Deal era, and this is where much of the 1970s back to the land movement found its roots.
Oh boy. Are you telling me we're going back?
We're going back.
Shit.
Not far.
Buckling in.
Buckling in, Marty. So to this point, I'm glad you got that joke, Matt. I mean,
Of
sometimes I
course.
say things and it's too young, too old for you. So
What, when you're talking about Zima?
Zima, yes,
Yeah, that was before my time.
R.I.P. Zima. To this point, we've kind of ignored the homesteader movement part of it. Like we've mentioned it because like Liberty Hyde Bailey had a lot of thoughts about it. Russell Lord talked about it for a bit and kind of was like, you know, these homesteaders, they've got the wrong idea, yada, yada, yada. But we haven't really gone into it yet. However, they are going to play a bigger role moving forward. So we do have to kind of do a little quick catch up. So the Back to the Land that we're going to be focused on today in the 1960s and 70s really found its beginnings in the 20s and 30s. When we had spoken about the New Deal era and Ruxford Tugwell's push for like homesteader communities,
Sexy Rexy
Sexy Rexy,
coming in hot.
there was this interesting dynamic that played out when he was like, hey, we should do this. Because many people that didn't like him, they're like, he's this communist trying to destroy America, blah, blah, blah. They're like, but hear me out. I like this. They like the idea of this like decentralizing food and relocating food systems in community. So like we talked about the Southern agrarians who are, you know, Elliot's favorite racists.
I mean, I just think it's cool when someone creates a whole new way to make racism worse. Like, really makes my ancestors proud.
Yeah, that accent gets a little bit thicker after you hear Southern agrarians. It's like a little bit more proud. So if you're not familiar with the Southern agrarians, check out the permanent agriculture episode. We did part one. Basically, they're really terrible people that made, like we just said, made racism worse somehow. There was a name we didn't bring up in those episodes that was around, a dude that sounds much more Italian than he looks. And there's this guy named Ralph Bordossi.
All right, I gotta find a picture.
Okay. He was something of an anti capitalist free marketer. So he was kind of like that libertarian, not necessarily right or left. And he founded this magazine called Free America, which, despite its hatred of government and corporations, found itself basically being like, hey, Tugwell, you're a terrible person who's trying to make America worse, but spend more money on these settlement projects. That is a good thing. Push for more money to be spent like the Tennessee Valley Authority, because that was returning power to rural communities. And he was basically like a Luddite in a sense, because he was very anti urban space technology, this like natural response to like the increasing mechanization, industrialization that was happening in the early 20th century.
I mean, those small government folks really stand a government when it supports their pet projects.
Exactly. Now, did you find a picture of him or no?
Yeah, that you're telling me he's Italian?
Supposedly. Yeah,
Okay.
barely, right?
All right.
Right. So anyways, this Free America magazine, one of the interesting things about it was actually their first advertisement was for maple syrup from Helen and Scott Nearing's first farm.
I mean, okay, like were the Nearings famous yet?
They weren't, not in like the agriculture space. Like he was still Scott Nearing, the guy that had the court case and yada, yada, yada. But like he wasn't like a big, like, oh, he's a farmer guy that people care about. But they actually didn't even use his name or their name on it. They just had the farm's name on it. But it's just kind of like one of those like crazy things.
Yeah, small world.
Exactly. Part of this decentering of power that Berdossi envisioned focused on this idea of like revival of regional identities, like regional culture, regional like variations of how religion was presented, all of these things that were kind of lost under like the big capitalist system, right? Where everything kind of got homogenized, especially like what they were worried about was it turning into what we have today, where most people kind of sound the same. We all go to McDonald's. Like you go to downtown, it's all the same restaurants. That was their big fear. And this was their way to try to push back against that. Obviously, it failed.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this vision was like very common at this time. Like there were a lot of like novels about like how these farmhouses were in like these dead or dying cultures and the farmhouse was abandoned, like the very like Faulkner-esque, like Southern Gothic, but also like variations of that in like New England and the West Coast, like all these like what they were called were I bought a barn books. And they were just basically what that sounds like. The hey, I bought a farm for the first time in my life and I've got this barn and yada yada yada. And it was like about like, it's hard, but we can be self-sufficient and like it's really satisfying and like we should all do this because it's a beautiful life. And it was like this like nostalgia of something that never existed that was very much fed by like that post-industrialization like longing for a life that never existed.
Well, I'm glad we left that in the past. I'm glad that that is over and done with, and we definitely don't have Instagram influencers who are like, buy a farm, I'll tell you how to do it.
Buy my course.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're talking still about the 20s and 30s, and like also what fed into this was obviously like the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression.
Those little things.
People being like, the government is not going to save me. I need to be able to feed myself even if I can't find a job, right? And like I said, there were people that were pushing back against this like nostalgic understanding of homesteading. And, fortunately, like Liberty Hyde Bailey, who literally grew up on a farm in the middle of the fucking woods, was like, yeah, that doesn't work that way. And he's like, I can tell you because I grew up on an apple orchard where there were no clear property lines because it was that like frontier like. And then you've got like Russell Lord, whose dad was one of those first back to the landers from the early 19th century, who saw like his dad have this like dream of having a homestead and it being like a nightmare, basically, like that he ended up going back to the suburbs and like the farm never made money and it was just like a nightmare. So you've got like these voices in the space being like, listen, these books are bullshit. Don't buy into it. Happy you care about farming, but this is not the solution.
You're trying to start the back to the suburbs movement.
Yeah, basically. And I think like Liberty Hyde Bailey's big thing was like, cool, have a garden. Like, that's awesome. We should all have vegetable gardens, but don't be under the illusion that it's anything more. Maybe plant some native plants in your front yard instead of crappy cultivars. As World War II rolled in, the government basically committed everything to to the war efforts, right? And all of the stuff Tugwell had been working on basically just was like tossed to the side. In 1943, in the midst of all of this, there was a book called The Have More Plan. It was published by Ed and Carolyn Robinson. And it was basically a how-to for homesteaders that was written in very basic language. And this would be like the last major book that would come out about this subject matter for multiple decades. And that's it. Now we're getting into the good stuff. In and out. Like I said, quick dip.
I mean, by your standards, that was lightning. Well done.
Lightning. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, jump into the post-World War II movement.
Hi, I'm Eric Holmesmeyer. Want to dive deeper into food forest design and management? Sign up for my Advanced Edible Forest Gardens course, an in-person weekend June 21st to 23rd in Southampton, Massachusetts. The course includes a field trip to a 20-year-old food forest at Paradise Lot and hands-on ecosystem mimicry, detailed design work, and planting an all-native forest garden. For gardeners, designers, and educators who have at least an introductory background in forest gardening or food forestry, more details at advancedforestgardens.eventbrite.com.
The post-World War II Back to the Land movement was unique for a bunch of reasons. And we can see, and we're going to trace it in the next episode, the way World War II, the Vietnam War, influenced homesteading and like white supremacy, ethno-nationalism, and like the alt-right, the crunchy to alt-right pipeline that people talk about. Like, while this seems like a new thing, this is actually something that's been going on for about 40 years. We're going to talk about that next week. Now, after the war and a little bit of time, about 5-10 years, people started to be interested in homesteading. Part of this was because like people could go back to the country after the war. They didn't need to go build bombs and planes and shit for war, right? So they could go back to like the rural country. Women weren't replacing men that had gone off to war. Soldiers were coming back and they were basically like, I don't want to be near anybody ever again, and going out to the country, which like fair.
Yeah.
So like one of the few times in history, there's actually a reversal of like the farm to city migration that has basically been in place since the Industrial Revolution. When this happens after the Korean War, it's much messier for some reasons that we're going to, again, talk about next week. Despite the initial return of the homesteader movement, by 1954, when the Nearings to the Good Life was published, people like the people that were going to go to the country had already done it by then. There's like that window right after the war. Everyone that wanted to make that transition, that was their time. Then people lost interest again. And when people did return to or want to go to that rural life, it was typically aligned with like what we saw with organics, what we saw with biodynamics. Like when he talked about John Hershey, and he like had all these super right wing positions on everything, and he was also a biodynamics guy. All these people fell into that Ralph Bordossi idea of like, I'm doing it to be independent, not to be like in a commune, the way like the Back to the Land movement was. So that part of the history of like organics, biodynamics, homesteading was still very much in that kind of right-wing libertarian space.
Okay, so I think what you're like pointing to is that up to this point, the homesteaders community reflected like the same politics that we saw in organics and in biodynamics, like much more right-wing, libertarian, like definitely like a overtone of racism and like a more like Christian right sort of thing.
Yeah. And while obviously not the entire grouping, it was like a large chunk of it. The soldiers returning from war that chose to go back to the country largely fell into that category. We're going to talk about it again more next week, but basically after every major war in the United States, there's been a massive influx in KKK membership, which is worth unpacking a little bit. And again, we are going to talk about that next week, which I feel like I just keep saying. But I just want to make note of that because it does explain some of that stuff that we just mentioned. In 1947, Bordossi began like writing that the sky was falling, that people had to return to the land before, in his words, inflation and the loss of their savings, the collapse of the post-war boom, followed by unemployment or World War III or with atomic bombing, makes it too late for them to do so. Obviously, didn't happen. I mean, Korean War happened, but like that didn't happen, right? And based on the childhood of the boomers, right, the post-war boom seemed to just never end, right? And any fears of like scarcity or like the sky is falling or like we can't grow enough food, all that stuff kind of stayed away until the 1970s.
I feel like I've heard that one before. The sky is falling. Buy my book.
Right? Many people define the beginning of the Back to the Land movement starting in the fall of 1967. And this is, for context, about 13 years after the Nearings released The Good Life.
How long was it before Kanye West released The Good Life?
50 years exactly.
I feel
40
like-
years,
Yeah.
maybe. That's a rough guess. I'm going to have to look that up now. I'm hoping it's exactly 40 years.
Let's see. 2007.
So 40 years, was I right?
Whoa. Yeah. Right on.
Nice. Look at me. I'm so smart. I guess so good.
I just want to have those bookends in place.
Yeah, I guess so good, everyone. Like, you can't stop me at guessing. All right, so 1967, right? The Summer of Love. The Summer of Love is interesting because there was love, but there was a lot of other shit going on. It highlighted the tension between like urbanization and homogenization and accelerating industrialization, as well as like this swell of young people who very quickly became the most powerful generation in the world because there was a ton of them and they all had like more money and more access to anything than any other generation had ever happened or had. And concurrently, in 1967, only about a dozen or so rural communes existed. However, within a few years, that number skyrocketed to like the thousands. So not like just from a couple dozen to a couple hundred, like exponentially grew. So the question is like, what happened in those years?
Nixon saw kids were getting fucked up and started the war on drugs.
Well, yeah, that happened. But what that was really kind of the surface tension breaking on what was going on. Now, in 1967, the famed Summer of Love was born out of like these various experimental cultures that bled into one movement, particularly in San Francisco. Obviously, other parts of the country, but a big focal point was San Francisco. And there was this idea that like the future was going to be great, right? There was endless hope for what the future held and that there was going to be peace, right? It was just peace, man. Everything was going to be peace. While at the risk of oversimplifying this, because of the fact that we're trying to cover a bunch of content in an hour or so, it was born out of a generation that really had never wanted. And I'm speaking obviously about like white people in particular, right? They have all these like fun drugs that are accessible and affordable. They've got tons of money from their parents, limitless opportunity because college was free. There was no real, other than the Vietnam War that was ramping up. At this point, there had never been like a serious war that really threatened them at home. And they didn't, broadly speaking, broad strokes, didn't really like war after they'd seen what it had done to their parents, right? They were all about like peace and mutual aid, whether that was through groups like the Diggers and like free stores or free medical services offered by the Haight Ashbury free clinics. This idea was like the future was going to be like kind of communal, right? Where things would be voluntary and that this was like the inevitable future. Like that's just their generation wanted it. They'd always gotten everything they wanted. So like this was going to happen because they wanted it. And while this time has been kind of identified as the moment of that birth of the Back to the Land movement in the 60s and 70s, its refocus on from changing society from the inside to changing society from the fringes becomes clear over the following years, which explains like them moving away from San Francisco and away from the cities versus like this vision of like, we're just going to live in the cities and we're going to change things from the inside to like very literally moving with the idea that they're changing things from the outside. And this happens because of what happens in 1969, which is basically when the government is like, we've had enough of your shit. Like, we're done with your crap. Like, this becomes most clear in May of 1969.
Okay, so this isn't the first time we've talked about state crackdowns on young people, right? And I guess like Chapingo in Mexico comes to mind.
Yeah, we had talked about Efraim Hernandez and Chapingo, which took place in 67, a few years prior. So that was probably some kind of influence on what was happening in the United States as well, because it was so big. Now, in May of 1969, there was this place called People's Park in California. What it was basically an abandoned parking lot that people had just decided to repurpose into green space. And it was just like, hey, no one's using it. People brought in like turf grass and flowers and trees and bushes, even like faculty members at the college nearby. And it was just kind of like, hey, this is a nice space for everyone to have. And it began to get too big, and there's too many hippies. And like, obviously, the California governor, Ronald Reagan, did not want to see a bunch of hippies taking over a parking lot. That was too much. And he basically told the police, like, do whatever the fuck you have to do to get these people out of this park. And what ended up happening was 128 people were hurt and one was killed because of turf grass.
Seems like a reasonable response from a pretty reasonable person. You know, I'd vote for him.
Fortunately, we learned a lot about Reagan, so we learned our lesson right then and there. And we're not feeling the consequences of that at all today.
Nope.
This is like the beginning of like a domino effect. So the next year, 1970, would be the famous Kent State Massacre. So between those two, and then like an increasing like police brutality on young people for protesting, and like basically a lot of the recoil from civil rights activities to the Vietnam War escalating. Basically, this generation that had never had anything bad happen to them felt like it was getting bombarded back to back to back with all this stuff. And like I think it just very much like broke them emotionally in a lot of ways.
I mean, Jesus, what a terrible time to be a Californian. You've got Nixon as your president and Reagan as your governor.
You could have called them the Dick Reagan team.
Mm-hmm.
The Dick gun.
I can see it on a campaign button now.
Right. Yeah. So it was just at this time where there was kind of this sweet spot in the rise of right-wing response. Basically, like what we saw with Trump after Obama, this was what was going on after the civil rights movement. It's like that counterweight was going on, and only good things happened.
I mean, no good deed goes unpunished, or no movement goes unreacted. Something.
Yeah. All good things. Now, unlike the movement of the 30s or the 1890s, this movement was fundamentally different. The hippies chose to move to the country not out of necessity or fears of economic catastrophe or food shortages, but basically out of a hatred of the system itself. Like, they were so disgusted with how the government reacted to them saying, hey, we want these things to change in the country. And the government was just basically, go fuck yourself or we will literally kill you. And they were just like, you know what? We're done. There is actual evidence kind of pointing like that this is actually what happened. Like a contemporary study called The Children of Prosperity did the study and actually made the case that, like, unlike all of the other back to the land movements, these homesteaders were, in their words, overwhelmingly white, under 30, and from economically, educationally, and socially privileged families.
I mean, I guess I knew that's like the stereotype, but a small part of me is surprised that it's like actually true.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's also worth noting, basically, if your dad had a full-time job that was like more than minimum wage at this point, and you were white, you were doing better than like 90% of people today. So
yeah, but Andy, you're forgetting one critical piece. iPhone. That's what I've been told my entire life. We have iPhones and they didn't, and six-figure debt.
So who cares that college is $80,000 a year?
Yeah, it's that's fine if I can FaceTime. No, I don't FaceTime.
If you FaceTime Sally Mae.
Can you do on an iPhone? Yeah.
Listen, you can FaceTime Sally Mae, so it's okay that you owe them like at least 2 organs.
It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. The world's never been better.
I don't need either of my kidneys, right? That's the rule?
No, I mean, it's half of everything, so you can take half your liver, half your kidneys.
Oh.
That's the key. Divide and conquer.
Shit. I gotta cut this short. I gotta make a call.
Yeah. All right. So in 1970, right after this like chaos happens, right? The Good Life was republished and it immediately sold out, 50,000 copies. It was also the same year that Matt's favorite magazine, Mother Earth News, was born and became the primary journal for the movement with nearly 500,000 subscribers in a few years. If you don't know Mother Earth News, good for you.
It's like every bad trope about homesteading wrapped into one convenient, glossy magazine.
Yeah. And we're going to talk more about it because it's a really fun story. And I know Matt's real excited about that.
It's on the list.
No, I mean like later today. Don't worry.
Nice.
Nice. All right. So at the same time, Ralph Berdosi's Flight from the City was reprinted in 1972. Rodale Press began reprinting major historical homesteading books like Samuel Ogden's This Country Life in 1973. Mother Earth News also reprinted the Robinsons Have More Plan. The book that I just mentioned was kind of like the last book done in the 50s, 40s, and before the homesteading movement died. They also printed an interesting book from E.F. Schumacher called Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered in 1973, which is where we got this concept of appropriate technology originally. And basically, this blast of all of this was in response to an interest, and a whole generation of young people bought in.
So I always thought Bookchin coined appropriate technology, but it was E.F. Schumacher.
Our boy Schumacher was a Bookchin contemporary and probably did influence Bookchin to an extent. I don't know enough about Bookchin to be 100% on that, but I do know that he was the one that coined the term. Interesting guy, worth a read.
Okay, so that one is going on the list.
Can go on the list.
Okay.
Do we have like a backup list, like in case we run out of content?
And I have to consult the scrolls. They're pretty long right now.
Yeah, they should be. It's the way it's supposed to be. But to Matt's point earlier, while the idea of like hippies living on a commune while collecting funds from mom and dad has been like this trope, many of the elders, the Nearing type folks who've been doing this, been done on the homestead, they found this narrative to be like fairly consistent. Like I said, the Nearings had a lot of people come to them. We talked about that a couple episodes ago. And they were kind of like this mecca, right? One thing Scott wrote was that most of the visitors who visited him were, in quote, raised in comfort, if not pampered in luxury. Never before in our lives had we met so many unattached, uncommitted, insecure, uncertain human beings who are apolitical, impatient of restraints, and little understood the sacrifice and self-discipline that was necessary and had driven many of the earlier back to the landers.
Get their ass.
That's coming from a dude who literally grew up in a company town where his dad or his grandfather owned the company. Not a good look.
Yeah, throwing stones and all that.
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind though is that like Scott and Helen were old, and like they had seen some shit. Like he grew up in the 19th century, and like he'd been around when people were coming to him. He was in his 80s. The world was a lot different when people started showing up at his doorstep at this point in his life. So I can kind of get it. I know everyone says like kids these days, but like objectively speaking, life was a lot harder in 1910 than 1970.
Yeah, that's fair enough. We do hear kids these days from every generation, but there's an element of truth to it.
Yeah. Additionally, the concerns of these new back to the landers were much different from prior generations as well. They weren't really worried about not having a paycheck. They weren't really like thinking about like old age or illness. Like there's no like long-term planning, right? And part of this could have been because a lot of them were young, because there was much stronger social safety nets by this point in time than in the 1910s and 20s. You know, Johnson's Great Society, all that stuff. While there were fears about the coming collapse of petrochemical agriculture, it didn't seem to be a driving motivator for many of the people that were coming to the land. Like Nearing and other movements, like we even saw with like John Hershey, the people that were coming to the land also were very critical of like gross consumerism, and like they were weary of giving up any sense of self-determination. Or in the words of Joan Wells, one of the writers at this time, they were driven to, in quote, become masters of their own schedule and reprogram oneself from imposed city routines.
And then some years later, they're requiring everyone to go back to work during a global pandemic. I guess that's what wealth does to a motherfucker.
Yeah, boomers. They really are the boomerang generation. I think that's what boomer is actually supposed to mean. Like boomerang, like they went pretty far to the left and then they came pretty far back to the right.
I like that. I think
right. It checks out.
Let's see if we can get it on a sticker.
Yeah, boomerang generation. And both the organics and biodynamics episodes we had talked about, despite the movements at this same time in the 60s and 70s becoming much more progressive socially, they also at the same time become like much more self-serving, right? And aligned with these like hyper individualist values. Like especially when we talked about organics in the Rodale Institute, like his whole thing was like, you are responsible for yourself and yourself only. You have to take like you have to make yourself healthier, buy organic food, do all this stuff. You have to consume the right things to be good and healthy. Like it's all about the like hyper individualism. And that was like broad scale at this time across the organics and biodynamics. And as we see in the Back to the Land movement, this continues. For a lot of them, being on the land was about personal independence, being financially disconnected from the system that they didn't like, even though they weren't because they're still getting money from mom and dad. For many, much like with the organics and Rodale, the idea of like saving the world meant you had to save yourself first. And this is where a lot of the green politics of environmentalism was born.
So the Rodale method, basically.
Yeah, all of them. This idea of like self-fulfillment and selfishness was actually good, or at least like to them. Like if I'm selfish, it's going to make everything better.
And fortunately, we learned that was a crock of shit and left it in history, right?
Again, we learn so many things from history. It's great.
Right?
We learn everything and don't make those mistakes again. I know I said I was going to talk a little bit more about Mother Earth News. Here we go. John Shuttleworth, founder and editor and publisher. He was a big advocate for this position, and we see him do some really great stuff with himself later on. He explained in 1975 in an interview how individualist approaches to solving global issues was understood. And he said that, like, and quote, show a man how to quit the corporate job he hates. You've given the guy's life back to him. And second, you've lessened the impact on the planet as much as if you had cut the population of India by 50.
Lovely.
Right? So basically, the rest of the world has to just be static and we will step back a little bit and everything will be well. Now, it wasn't just Shuttleworth and Rodale who paired like individuality with like being revolutionary, much like we see on Instagram today. Other authors like John and Sally Seymour, who wrote Farming for Self-Sufficiency, also make the same case that wouldn't happen, not likely to happen, but could not happen without self-sufficiency. And without self-sufficiency, the system would actually crumble and fall. And if we don't become self-sufficient individually, it was going to set up the world for basically an apocalyptic future.
It just like, it blows my mind that Reagan literally had police shoot at these people. And then they were like, hey, he's got a point.
So these narratives also overlap with a lot of contemporary and historical understandings of like autonomy and masculinity. There's a lot of facets to this. We could dive into this much more, but I'm not really interested in getting super deep into it. So I'm just going to kind of skim over a lot of these different perspectives and how they fell into the Back to the Land movement. But this one's a pretty interesting one. This idea of like hyper-masculinization of men in particular during this time actually earned Mother Earth News the acronym MEN by contemporary feminists. That they would argue that like all the interviews were focused on like land management, land ownership by men. And this caused like a lot of women's only colonies that sprung up in response to the power dynamics that were inherent in many of these communities, which basically were the classic like women still have to do women's work and they aren't treated any differently, except now they're not cooking in a conventional kitchen, right? They're using a wood fucking furnace to cook. So many of these communities would offer women like actual autonomy and independence from men in patriarchy.
I know it's like a meme now, but it's literally like, yeah, he reads theory, but does he do the dishes?
Exactly. Now, it really boils down to this idea of like having good intentions and then failing to either see the subtle ways you benefit from your identity or being like, well, actually, I don't want to do that. So let's see if anyone notices that I haven't given up that privilege.
And they did it old school without preaching it on social media.
Oh man, boomers would have been so bad if they had social media back then.
I know.
Oh,
Count our blessings. We dodged that one.
thank God.
Now they just get to spread COVID misinformation.
And like, what's that? David Avocado Wolf and shit like that. Oh man, I only know that because I've seen my mom post it on Facebook. But yeah, there's like all these like fake like naturalist yada 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 bullshitters. There's a lot of it. Anyways, we should go to a commercial.
Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you
that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into The Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show. You looking up David Avocado Wolf? Or are you just...
Yeah, such as raw foodism, anti-vaccine sentiment. Yeah.
Dude's winning it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, like we said, despite equal work across gender on many communes, at least on paper, for women, their work was always less equal. They were still responsible for bearing the roles of labor, just like men, but they also carried a lot of that conventional unpaid work of the mundane, the laundry, the carrying water, the feeding the children, all the stuff that kind of was like women's work on top of like a full-time job. However, for many of the women whose expectations had been to like maintain a home for their husbands, this at least made them feel productive and like have some sense of independence at a time when independence for women was still like largely inaccessible.
And just for context, 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So women could get credit cards.
Right after this, so when this was happening, they still could not apply for their own bank account or credit card.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So then that puts some context, right? The point is that like for many women, this was still kind of like a small step forward. So behind this like, you know, free love movement of collective ownership and radical positivity, were still a lot of those deeper undercurrents of the dynamics of capitalism, right? The patriarchy and so on. Gender issues exploited the language of the movement with like self-serving activities that are painted as revolutionary, right? You know, growing corn is an environmental act because you weren't buying it from the store, as though they were growing less because you had a 10 by 10 plot in your backyard, right? Totally like a selfish way of understanding revolution and sacrifice, right? A lot of people refused to pay taxes, and this was like a challenge to the American war machine, even though like they weren't doing it for that reason. They were doing it because they wanted the money for themselves. So the language of like a lot of this revolutionary politics was really just applied to things that were selfish without changing any of these fundamental power dynamics. All they did is they moved out from the city and went into a rural environment.
I feel like seeing how boomers grappled with radical politics helps explain so much of like how we got where we are today. Bill Clinton literally did this and like third way politics, and we're going to talk about helping Black communities and say all the right things while being like just as bad as the right and gaslighting anyone who suggests otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see the birth of the modern Democratic Party here, right? This idea of like the dynamics of like self-fulfillment as like revolutionary praxis is like infused into every relationship around the homestead, right? Anything you do for your homestead is revolutionary because you're not engaging with capitalism, even though it's like not challenging it. So how is that really doing anything? It's just one less consumer and one less person that's feeding into the system. It's not necessarily revolutionary. It's just like a personal choice. And this creates like this inverse rat race, though, where it's like, who can be as disconnected from civilization and capitalism as possible? And part of this is like the Nearings, right? Because they're like literally lived without electricity. And their whole thing is like, you don't have to work. We only garden a few hours a day and then do whatever we want. You just have to be willing to sacrifice enough so you don't have to work. And like, that was the issue with them, is that nobody could do what they did. And that was part of like this like inverted version of consumerism, of like kind of like minimalism, but for nature, right? While many of the people that came to these farms and started homesteading had come from families with discretionary incomes, like the Nearings did. In the words of one particular Back to the Lander that I was reading, he said, in quote, "If you happen to have a nest egg, you are careful to keep it quiet and spend it unobtrusively," end quote. So like in reality, it was more about aesthetic than actual practice. And like the idea of like being ideologically and personally like pure or consistent was basically impossible for most people, but everyone pretended they could do it.
Yeah, and I think not meeting your ideological goals is fine, but this reminds me a lot of like what the left struggles with a good bit today is conversations around intersectionality, where like people are arguing back and forth about something, but everyone's opinion is dismissed because the person that they're arguing with has like a more marginalized status, and that kind of trumps the argument.
Yeah, like we can't have opinions, or like if someone's opinion is different, then we can invalidate it based on who has the most boxes checked, right? And that's not really a constructive way to have conversations. Like obviously it's one thing for two white dudes to be talking about like race politics, but it's another thing to like just try to have a conversation about a subject matter in broad strokes and just like come with good faith, right? That like we agree politically on a lot of stuff, so we probably have some common ground, and that we shouldn't assume the worst in each other when we start conversations, right? That like we're not secretly fascists or something like that, right? We're all in the same like sport, same team, right? Even if we're not in the same team, we're like still in the same sport, and like we should always act like that. And we can't really seem to figure that part out. It also speaks to the fact that like despite the people that were likely legitimately interested in like making a material change in the world around them, they couldn't because the movement didn't seem to create any depth culturally, right? There's no real buy-in, which is why we end up seeing this whole thing kind of like fizzle out, kind of like meaningless, right? The roots of the movement were very specifically tied to like the money that came from conventional society more than they were ever willing to let on. Now, as the movement continued to grow into the early 1970s, and as evidenced by the continued release of major books in the space at this time, we see it continuing to grow. And then in 1972, the energy crisis hit. We talked about this a bit with the Nearings. We talked about it with the organics movement, but now we're going to talk about it from the perspective of the Back to the Land movement. As these energy shortages and inflations took hold, by 1975, much of the writing about the movement changed and began to actually address some of those material issues that past generations had been concerned about. Things like budgeting, how to find a job, working, keeping your farm financially afloat. All those things that were not an issue for so many years.
Daddy can't afford your vacation in the woods anymore.
Right? Basically. Now, as pressures mounted for the movement to show like successes, because we have all these like books and writers and like, this revolutionary fervor that they're going to change the world, but they're not doing anything, right? Something needed to change. And we see this with like the Mother Earth News. John Shuttleworth becomes much more militant about his radical politics, and he gets really frustrated that nothing's actually changed. And he starts kind of swinging to the right a little bit, the way many people do when it feels like movements don't go anywhere. He blames the unholy trio of modern society, meaning government, business, and big labor, which, should be your first inclination. Something was amiss. And he argued that the problem wasn't that the movement hadn't actually built an alternative to capitalism. It was instead these outside forces that like big labor, big business, big government were not allowing for people to do what they wanted to do. Now, Shuttleworth has always had historically aligned himself as an anarchist, but at this point, he basically, within a few years, aligned with much of that historical, organic, biodynamic, homesteader, Ralph Bordossi, far-right, libertarian, fasc-adjacent kind of space.
Okay, and so it does raise this like interesting question of why these people seem to keep finding themselves in these like fascist adjacent options, especially when times get tough, like before World War II. Like it's easy to talk about equality when there isn't a knife at your throat, whether it's like a physical knife or a financial knife.
The metaphorical knife.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's worth remembering that, like, for many people in the fascist movement, like, and I'm not talking about like the way we like when we think about fascism today, it's very different than how people thought of fascism before World War II. That, like, Jorian Jenks, our buddy who is the organics guy, like the big organics guy in England, who is like a terrible person, anti-Semite, just awful. But he also wanted affordable, healthy food for people in his community. And that was like his big thing. Like, it was just the other stuff. He was like, yeah, we need to get rid of immigrants. But it wasn't his primary concern. It was just kind of like this thing that it wasn't like today where we think like a fascist means like they want to like genocide an entire people. And like that's their primary interest is like, I just hate blah, blah, blah. And that's not really how it was historically before basically what happened in Germany. So for many people, fascism was really an attempt to return power to communities against government, against capitalism, against industry, right? And they were just really fucking racist, and they did a lot of shit that was like traditional, we know is terrible. So my point is that it's not like surprising that people who weren't willing to give up their benefits of contemporary capitalism and patriarchy would find themselves more willing to shift into like this fascist adjacent position. This is kind of why like the whole horseshoe theory does have some merit.
Yeah, but is there a solution to white dudes not wanting to give up the benefits of that station without them turning to fascism?
Honestly, I couldn't tell you. But I do think that like pretending it doesn't exist isn't going to help things.
Right.
But anyways, as the dust settles for these new homesteaders over the years that they were on the land, as those trust fund checks stopped arriving, the drudgery, the grim reality of homesteading wore on many young adults that were realizing like, you know, maybe working for dad's company isn't that bad. Many began to move back to their homes. And one thing we haven't talked about is like, why were these young people able to like buy farms for whatever 8 jobless kids could scratch together? And that's we're going to talk about next week. But I do just kind of want to put that little thought bubble in your brain. Like, there's a lot of farms that are cheap that these kids are buying up, and they have no connection to those communities. I wonder if this is a significant indicator of something else going on, this inverse component to what we're talking about. There is. But back to our friendly boomer hippies. At this time, inflation was rising, unemployment was rising. Families couldn't support their children's hobbies living on a commune. Most of these 20-somethings returned back home and put their degrees to use, while others just simply got tired of using outhouses and shitting next to the blueberry bushes. And within 8 years or so, the movement had been largely abandoned.
Well, that's anticlimactic.
Yeah, it's unsurprising that the boomers just said fuck it and left it. When the going gets tough, the boomers rang. Boomerang, get it?
Yeah.
It's not my best work. Sorry, I got nothing for this one.
Gotta keep working on it.
Yeah, we'll workshop it. I should probably say I feel like we've dogged on the back to the land movement quite a bit, but there were like some really interesting and important people in this time period. I do think like there's a lot of legitimate people that were interested in trying to make something and genuinely put the effort in. I do think that's a minority, but those people absolutely existed. Like, I don't want people to be like, well, I know so-and-so that was from the back to the land movement. They're fantastic. They're doing all this cool shit. Like, those people absolutely exist. Is that a reflection of a large piece of the movement? No. But yeah, the movement basically died off by the late 70s. We can see this by like the readership of Mother Earth News. For some reason, there's like a lot of data about their readership, and it's really helpful. In 1977, at this tail end of the Back to the Land boom, a reader survey showed that the average reader was 32 years old, which put that in context, 69 was 8 years ago. That would be 24 years old. So someone that's out of college, been fucking off in San Francisco for a few years. That checks out. More than 60% of them were college graduates, which in the 70s is like really fucking high. Like, I think there was it 37%, 39% of people today have a college degree. So like if you said 60% of your readers are college graduates, that's a high percentage today. So in the 70s, that's just crazy high. and 3/4 were homeowners and made a median yearly income of like $18,000, which is like significantly higher than the national median income of the time. So like this highlights like one of the critiques that Russell Lord had of the Land magazine in the 1950s, that like these like lofty ideas, progressive ideas that the magazine was pushing was geared toward like primarily like rich hobby farmers rather than like working class farmers.
And probably people who returned home and still wanted to hobby farm and or like bought a house after working for a year because that was something you could do.
It was. By the early 1980s, Countryside magazine subscriptions fell from 40,000 to 4,000, a 90% drop. Yeah. Mother Earth News resorted to like backyard DIY projects, like basically like modern, craftsmanship or some bullshit kind of stuff to like keep people to read them.
You got some fun ones.
There could be. I mean, I like a good deck. I can't argue. Like a good big deck. How do you say no to that? Now, while a lot of this conventional like homesteading type content was drying up, other related subjects continued to draw a lot of attention. Things like alternative energy, organic food as a consumptive thing, not a growing thing, herbal medicine, a lot of stuff that like feeds into like some of the bigger, broader stuff that we see moving forward with like the crunchy to alt-right pipeline. We see with the death of this movement new opportunities for people from this movement that were disillusioned to coalesce with people that we haven't talked about and we'll talk about next week, to like tie into like this bigger distrustful anti-government, anti-big pharma, food, blah blah blah, like anti all that stuff movement that kind of explains a lot of why we are where we are today, right? And like I said, we'll go much more in detail on that next week. By the end of the 20th century, many of these idealists who had done this whole thing, moving to the land, living in a commune, blah, 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 instead were writing these books like Back from the Land. And a lot of them were like people like criticizing some of the stuff they were sold.
I mean, that sounds like cashing in on a trend right there.
And ultimately, it was in my opinion, the purity politics of the movement of having to disconnect from all of society, that all of the changes society needed to be addressed in their new vision, while again never really challenging or changing the dynamic of power that underscored the day-to-day living. To Matt's point, this like, yeah, he's read the theory, but does he do the dishes? Like, if you don't change those dynamics, you can't create material change. And I think not only did the need to do that drive some to the right, but it also empowered much of the far right, as we'll see again next week.
Oh, good. More white supremacy. Yippee!
Yeah, I mean, I know I said we only do history, but we actually only do white supremacy history now. I should be much more specific.
God.
It's super fun.
And I wanted to talk about nut trees. I wanted to talk about, mostly nut trees. So
yeah,
this is...
well, now we're just nuts instead. There's no trees.
Fuck.
But we are getting to the end of this kind of winding story of like alternative ag in the US. But it points to like the fact that many of these movements never really try to address the systemic issues, which is why they haven't really been real solutions. And it's not that the solutions need to be perfect, but a lot of the major issues have been just mostly ignored. And it makes these movements like destined to fail, right? And in my opinion, like, I know some people will be like, well, at least they tried. Why are you so negative about everything? But if we don't understand the history of these movements, we can't engage with them fully and comprehensively, right? Like, I know people are tired of hearing about it, but the fact that I've never really heard anyone else talk about these issues, I think speaks to the fact why it needs to be brought to the light. It's not to say, like, don't buy organic foods because of fucking Jorian Jenks, but, like, that's fine, but understand it within like this bigger broad strokes context, right? It's that we have to understand these things and their limitations for the problems around us.
I mean, white people love to talk about anti-racism until it's time to do anti-racist shit.
And I love we're doing this episode without Elliot. It just...
Yeah, it's good
beautiful
timing.
Yeah. And there were, like, to my point earlier, there was some good stuff that came from this movement. The land trust model that people are always trying to do today, this actually came from a collaboration between Ralph Bardossi and another guy named Robert Swan. the echo of the movement into the 80s also provided some of that necessary nuance. Like, I mean, we were kind of joking about like the big decks from the Mother Earth News magazine, but like that's probably a much more realistic and like, in my opinion, less performative way to get people to engage with the world around them in their backyard and growing food in gardens and like appreciating the ecosystem around them than to be like, well, if you don't live off the woods and not use electricity, then are you even really like an anarchist or whatever the fuck, right? That you should find ways to find enjoyment from these practices, while also, if you can, reduce the power industrial society has on your ability to live the life you want, right? Like there's a balance to it. And while like these magazines in particular show the fall of the movement, I think it's more important that we see the movement itself mature and engage with the subject matter more pragmatically.
Damn. That's probably the most positive ending you've ever put on one of these.
I'm turning over a new leaf or something.
Hopefully.
Thanks.
So homesteading next week?
Homesteading next week, and it's going to be so much worse. There's so much stuff you don't know about white supremacists in the 20th century, the late 20th century. It's going to be real fucking depressing.
Fantastic. I can wait to hear it.
I know you were just so amped. But if you guys enjoyed this, you want sources, citations, all that good stuff, you can go
just
up on our Patreon, or just
trust us.
Call Matt. His number is 75.
No.
Yeah.
I think that was 11 numbers.
Was it? Yeah. So call Matt. That's my source. And he didn't know that, so that's really fun. What I do is I drip a little bit of various hallucinogenics into his nighttime drink.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he's sleeping, I go and I poke him a little bit so he's half awake, and I record everything he says.
Yep.
And I've been doing this for about 9 months now. So that's been fun because he's moved quite a bit. It got a little pricey for a while when he was in Hawaii, but we got it done.
I know how you keep finding
thanks to
me.
you supporters.
I never send you the address.
Yeah, you don't need to tell me. I will find you. So go subscribe to the Patreon so I can continue getting great sources for our content from Matt. And Substack, go check that out. I think that's it. We'll be back next week with Homesteader white supremacy content. And and then we're going to permaculture, which I know people are just like, haven't you already talked about it? But we're going to talk about the history of it, which like nobody has ever done, which is just like, first should be a giant fucking red flag. Second, yeah, it's going to be fun. We only do fun content. And if you don't think this is fun, then what is fun to you?
Anything else? Let's talk about how to grow tomatoes.
Just end it now. Let's just do it. Do the tomatoes.
Yeah.
No, we're not doing the tomato. We're never doing tomatoes. Anti-tomato gang.
Anti-tomato action.
ATA, yes, I like that. ATAF. Anti-tomato action front.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Did you just meow at me?
No, I said yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, we should end this. I guess so good.